Good afternoon, folks. Thank you so much for coming out. My name is Isaac Zablocki. I am the director of the Other Israel Film Festival and the director of the Carol Zabar Center for Film here at the Marlene Meyerson JCC Manhattan. We are really excited about this afternoon. We have a full day of events at 2:30. We have A Place of Her Own. It's an Israeli documentary about Palestinian women in an Arab village looking to start a community center to support all the work that the communities needs there, followed by The Smugglers, which is about the last Arabic bookstore in Jaffa. And then we close the evening with Holding Liat, which really gives a diverse look at some of the nuance that goes into from one family who's trying to bring back their daughter who was taken hostage after October 7th, and gets into the nuance of really what Israel has gone through in the last 2 years from a perspective of peacemakers. Much more coming up all week. We're here till Thursday, so please spread the word and join us for more. We want to thank all of our partners who are part of this festival, who help support and who are doing the work on the ground on a daily basis. This festival goes beyond just movies, and we follow every film with a conversation and also some standalone conversations. And we're really proud to have here a special panel that's being led by one of our key partners this year, Haaretz. So how many of you read Haaretz? If you don't, you can leave now. It's okay. Now, if you don't, then come to us. Hopefully, you'll be surprised. But you'll learn more. And we're really excited to have here a panel of four of Haaretz's amazing writers, reporters, along journalists, being moderated by Maya Lecker, who really leads this English version. So please welcome the journalists Ben Samuels, Shany Littman, Etan Nechin, and Arash Azizi. Please join us. Thank you. And again, to moderate, please welcome Maya Lecker. Thank you very much. I'll just start off by saying this conversation on the topic of in a time of boycott and censorship from all sides, having four journalists here talking about the environment from within Israel and from the outside is one of the key topics that we've been contending with as a film festival, as we've been silenced in many ways from many different directions. And I very much believe that there needs to be a platform for freedom of speech and to hear things that we might disagree with and might find offensive, but are willing to have a conversation about it. So please be a part of this conversation. We'll, of course, take time for your questions as well. And now I hand things over to Maya. Thank you very much, Maya.
Thank you. I know you probably all know Haaretz and what we do, but for the context of the festival, there are two recent events that I'd like to bring up. One of them was in this city, in a place, I guess, not very different from this one, that hosted Channel 12 right-wing commentator Amit Segal, where he said to the sound of applause that Haaretz.com is the #1 threat to Israel's position in the world. So I hope nobody's too threatened right now. But I think that for me, it wasn't surprising to hear it from him. I think in a way I was surprised by how it was received here and not in Israel. And only a few weeks before that, when the movie that if you came to the opening of the festival, you've watched The Sea, which is an excellent film by Shai Polak. When that movie won the Israeli Ophir Awards and became the Israeli contender for the Oscars, was met with a culture minister that hasn't watched the film, but called it a slap in the face of Israeli citizens and a spit in the faces of our heroic soldiers. Since I personally think the film makes Israel look probably better than it is these days, I find that a little odd. But I think these two things are the world that we work in right now, and we obviously don't see ourselves as a threat, but more of people that are just trying to do work that they find important. And I thought that we could start with our reporter saying a little bit about how they, the first days of after October 7th, and how they did their job then, and how much that has changed. And I'd like to start with Shany.
Hi. Okay. Does it work? Yeah. So the first day I was like everybody else in shock. I couldn't. It was a Saturday. I was hiding with my family in a shelter at a friend's house, and it was really hard, since it was really hard to understand what is actually going on for me as a magazine writer, someone who doesn't cover the news but writes about like more try to find more deepened, enlarged issues to write about that requires more time and perspective. It was really hard to understand how am I going to be part of the coverage of this event. So it took me a few days, and then I started going to the civic mobilization organizations that try to help the refugees from the areas that were affected by the war, and just to try and cover obviously the Israeli side of the event, which was I don't know how to describe it. I mean, words are really weak in these circumstances. But it was a shock, and I felt that this sense of victimhood that I never felt before as an Israeli. And I think it affected the first few weeks of work as well as a journalist.
I think not only that you're a magazine writer, but as a writer that is usually writing about culture and film, you became maybe one of the writers most engaged with the families of hostages and evacuees.
It was actually, it took us a while to understand that the hostages is such a big story. That's also interesting because I went to a press conference just a few days after October 7th, and I met some families of hostages. Some of them weren't even hostages. Eventually, like they were declared dead, but at that time, like it took several days before the authorities could actually understand who was kidnapped and who was killed. And so it was the first time, I think it was maybe 5 days after October 7th, that I actually understood that this is a huge story, that so many civilians were abducted. It was just, nobody, at the first days, I think people couldn't even, also at the newsroom, it was hard to grasp that this is actually happening, that there are children being held, children and older elderly people being held by Hamas in Gaza. It was just like, I think it was really a matter of even, I don't know, maybe disbelief or something. So then I started, I decided to go to see those families of the hostages and interview them. And I continued doing that for a few months. And when they started coming back, I also tried to interview the hostages themselves. But at that point, it was already like, the biggest story in the Israeli media. So a lot of, other outlets were trying to get the stories, and it became like a race. Who's gonna get them first?
Yeah, but I wonder about the hostage families because obviously when Haaretz reports about Gaza and what happens inside Gaza, you can't say that there's a race in the Israeli media to beat them to it.
No competition there.
No.
Yeah.
And with the hostages, and this is something that you brought up before about how fast it became something that you were doing as journalism, but the government was using as propaganda. It's also very evident in a film that some of you might see later, Holding Liat. And then I'm wondering where you started noticing that these people, the victims of this conflict that are not Gazans or anti-Israel or anything, became a target of the government in a way that
you mean when it became a political issue?
Yes.
The hostages? I think I remember a father of one of the hostages. I interviewed him. It was more than a year, I think, already into the war, and he said, "I would never think that I will hear the words the fight for the release of hostages." Like he couldn't understand. This is someone who was not born in Israel, and he came as a Ole Chadash, and he always believed that Israel is the safe haven for Jews, and that it will do everything to protect its people. And then when his daughter was kidnapped, he realized that he had to go on a fight in order to release, to bring to her release. And he couldn't. He said, I couldn't believe that that's the situation, that I need to, that it's not like the most obvious thing that everyone here wants the hostages to be released in any price. So, I mean, I realized that before, because it became when the demonstrations for the families of the hostages became very, they became political, I think, a few months after October 7th, and by the reaction, it was more the reaction of the oppositions. I don't know how to define the people who didn't want the hostages to be released. I mean, there were families, like there was this organization of the hostages' families, and then there was another organization that started by someone, we don't even exactly know whom, but it was kind of some of the families of the hostages, they were against the negotiation for a deal that will include ceasefire and the release of prisoners. So that was, I mean, slowly it became also a political issue.
I think Ben, as someone who was watching all of this from Washington. And a lot of the hostage families said pretty quickly that they were being received in Washington very differently than they are in Jerusalem, and I'm wondering how that was to cover.
Yeah, I mean, first off, it's a pleasure to be here with you all, and thank you very much for coming. I think there were just two completely separate information wavelengths that were happening. One was in Israel and one was in Washington. And in Washington, there was pretty large bipartisan agreement that freeing the hostages was number one, first and foremost. That was the key issue. I'm talking in the initial days and weeks after October 7th and the ensuing Gaza war. There was a real sort of unification of thought in a way that really hadn't existed in terms of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in Washington for years, if not decades. One of the key facts of Benjamin Netanyahu's term, his reign as Israeli prime minister, I guess you could say, is the rapid politicization of Israeli politics in America. And that was done intentionally. That wasn't just a sort of after effect. That was very much his own plan in terms of what would be best for the Israeli right. And, in the days and weeks after October 7th, you really saw a just sort of unified, unquestioned, bipartisan, full force. It was one of the only things that Joe Biden could get Republican support of in months, if not years, of his first term, that free the hostages. That is number one. No calls for ceasefire. There were maybe 10 lawmakers maximum that were calling for a ceasefire in the initial weeks. But other than that, everyone was saying free the hostages. And I think there was a real information gap, both in terms of how American media was covering it, how lawmakers were talking about it, the information that lawmakers were getting, just how little recovering the hostages really was at the top priority of the Israeli government and the Israeli military in the initial stages of the war. And I think it's something that the Biden administration was figuring out in real time, that this was a situation that needed active management so it wouldn't spiral too far out of control, so it wouldn't start a regional war, so it wouldn't further endanger the hostages. But I think there was a real absence of acute understanding of just exactly the issues that the Israeli government was posing in terms of recovering the hostages.
I know that some of you were, like Ben and Etan and Arash were going through this from here. From Israel, I can say that we were, I think it was pretty quick, even though we had reporters that were living through, October 7th themselves, that we felt the need to start covering the Israeli reaction to that, and became pretty much the only Israeli media doing that. While we were doing that, I think Etan was here in New York covering then I guess mostly campus wars, and being a lot of times pretty much boycotted by every side. And so I'm interested in how that was.
Yeah, so on October 7th, we were upstate actually. I was covering the New York Film Festival, writing a piece about Maestro by Leonard Bernstein, about the nose. And beyond the personal, my family there, very quickly, within a day or two, you start seeing two narratives happening. On the one side, from academia, culture, left-wing organizations, really, on that day already, posting stuff about solidarity with Palestinians. Pretty quickly, after a day, there was a big protest in New York. A few days later, there was a pro-Palestinian protest in Colombia. On the other side, there were a manifestation already of right-wing culture, players, think tanks, already kind of, Chris Rufo from the Manhattan Institute, a few days later, sent a tweet, we need to start linking Hamas with academia, woke culture. So you saw these two narratives kind of very much crystallizing in the first few days. We lived at that time just out near Colombia. And you can see those fault lines really crystallize into a war that was basically another war, not with weapon, even though now, Trump sending a National Guard has some sort of military component to this project. And these boycotts from cultural institutions was seen as their sort of weapon, right? A weapon of culture. And between these two narratives, there's the Israeli narrative, Israeli civil society, which became harder and harder to explain. At first, in the first few months, there was a lot of open letters by writers, artists, kind of condemning the left for its alienation, but also kind of maintaining that, we are better than this, And as time went by and the war became pure war vengeance, and those the stories of hostage families coming here, at first begging Biden, but then really begging Trump, please make Bibi release our brothers and sisters, became really hard to tell that Israel is a civil society, and we have the capacity of doing change in our own society. So it became like these narratives of pro-Israel, pro-Palestine became really hardened. And we're seeing that, I started in the campus wars and now the mayoral race, right? So it's kind of trickled down to everything. A race to nuke mayor became this referendum on Israel. So these narratives are still very strong, and telling the story of Israeli civil society has become really, really difficult. And these are of the few spaces that allow this to happen.
Before we open up to questions, I wanted to ask Arash about, I think that one thing that scares me as an Israeli, obviously I am scared of how the Israeli government demonizes its critics, and it becomes more and more assertive at silencing them in ways that are either financial or more than that. But in a way, I do still feel as a journalist that I am not, as a Jewish Israeli journalist, I am not in danger in a way that a lot of journalists are other places in Gaza, but also just in a lot of places around the world. And in a way, it scares me how fast a lot of Israeli journalists became just complicit in a narrative that they have no problem to be part of, and just their censorship that I see more as something that comes from within. And so there's in a recent article that you wrote for The Atlantic with the director Panahi. So there's a scene there that he describes, or you describe, of two Iranian filmmakers and a sociologist walking around the prison ground. And the sociologist is teaching them a lesson in nonviolent resistance. And there was something about how it was described that, obviously made me think, like, how far are we from a scene like that? So I'm interested also in, like, just your perspective of, like, how fast these things deteriorate, and how, if there's a message that you would want to give Israeli journalists in how not to give up so fast.
Yeah, the question of how fast it can happen is fascinating. Iran has did not have proper freedom of speech for most of its modern history. Other places like Turkey, for example, have seen it decline in recent years. I think what is interesting, I'll say from a couple of angles. The not giving up is fascinating. So the scene you describe is like it's Jafar Panahi himself and Said Madani, this sociologist who used to hold classes in his cell, but they banned the classes. So he organized what are called walking classes, and they walk together, and he keeps talking, which is sort of kind of surreal because it's like from a film itself. And Panahi itself has really been making films in a clandestine manner for years, not giving up. There are always Iranian civil society. They're always so inspiring to me. I forget that this used to be me as well, and when I was there, I did similar things because it's like so heroic, frankly, how they keep on keeping on. I would say, knowing that it really matters, and that it does really make a difference is what make them go on. But the question is about the repression. The scary thing is, of course, that a huge parts of society become desensitized to it. And so in Iran, we don't have free press inside the country, but outside the country, there are outlets that are free, funded by foreign governments, usually like Britain and United States, who broadcast to Iran. But there's usually a war against the journalists there as well, on the part of a lot of people who are angry at them and who think they're not doing a good job, but they really start sort of targeting them. And the other thing about journalists inside the country that really matters, it's this, what I would call is kind of a scourge of extremism of some sorts, that you start thinking, oh, they're not doing, so the journalists in Iran have to fight on two fronts. Obviously, they're not allowed to report fully, they're not allowed to do a full job, but there are others who are questioning them as to, why are you publishing at all? And this boycott, I want to sort of speak against this in a very serious way from examples from Iran. It's pretty much never a good idea to boycott an outlet, just as an outlet. I mean, there are maybe exceptions at times, right? But there are newspapers inside Iran. They're limited in what they can say. They have to always put Khamenei on the first page whenever he speaks with the full sort of title and all that. But these newspapers are doing really great work. And yet, unfortunately, there are some Iranians who will say, oh, don't publish there or don't write there. And I want to say that I was actually driven out. I have never not written for a paper because it was in Iran. It's them who, someone calls them, says, oh, well, I used to write film reviews until even years when I was abroad. I remember actually one time the guy said, well, you're not the same Arash Azizi who says all the political stuff, right? Because we would get into that trouble. But I fought for the right is what I'm trying to say. I fought for the right to be published. I led the government to say, oh, no, you can't publish him. And the last thing I'd say that is important is that, we all know the repression aspect. So they put you in jail and all that, which is terrible. But I never forget, I once worked at a newspaper and it was closed down. It was actually closed down because we reported on a student union in Iran that had published a statement that opposed, both Israel and Hamas. And so we published a student union and they closed down the entire newspaper. And in Iran, that's basically how it works. If they don't like it, then there's no censor before the publishing. So it comes out, if they don't like it, it's a risk. They close down the whole thing, so there's a lot of self-censorship. But so we all know about the cost of it, obviously repression and stuff. But economically, right? I'll never forget the face of this guy who was the person who makes lunch at these Iranian newspapers. They always give you lunch in Iranian newspapers. And he was like, well, I lost my job. And tons of people, and many of those people quit journalism because the idea was that, this is not a stable profession if we get booted out all the time. So I think it's important to remember that it's not just prison and stuff, but how, and we see that in Turkey a lot, how they make journalism an unlivable profession by economic punishment, effectively.
I can add that in Israel after October 7th, there were a lot of documentaries that were made and by filmmakers that don't see themselves, that before didn't see themselves as part of the Israeli propaganda, and by the reaction that they had to this event was to try to participate in the hasbara. It's not. It was also a kind of a surprising effect, I think, of maybe not surprising, but many filmmakers just decided that they have to show the world what happened in Israel, and I think that a few months later, their films that had one intention became part of the were weaponized by the Israeli government in order to justify its war, unending war, revenge war in Gaza.
I just want to say that on that, I think it's it's obviously such a politicized topic, anything relating to Israel and Palestine, and I think there is politics in everything we do. First of all, I think the one honest admission journalists should do is that we're not pieces of wood or don't have opinion about things. Journalists have. We should be truthful and honest and sometimes in a manner of speaking impartial, right? But obviously Haaretz is different from Jerusalem Post for a reason, right? So I think we shouldn't pretend like we're somehow oracles of without politics. There's politics in what we do, but we don't control what we report. And I think this super sensitivity all the time about if I say this, how can it be used? Sometimes gets at, I think it's good to worry about it and think about it, right? But I think we should also acknowledge that there's a limit in what we have.
Yes, but when the purpose of what you do, first of all, it's not an article in the newspaper. It was There were documentaries that were, it takes a while to work on it to produce a documentary, but I think the purpose, the very open and declared purpose of those documentaries was to show the world what had been done to us. So that was, you could kind of guess that at some point someone will use it for something.
I think the more worrying process that happened in making documentaries and movies like that is that people in a very fast-forward way left behind the way that they did things before, because of we need to show the world something that was done to us. So maybe
it's urgent to do it.
It's urgent.
You have
so
to do it now.
maybe the facts are murky, but we'll do it anyways, and maybe we got support or money from someone that we otherwise wouldn't, but because this is so important, then we will. That, I think, is more worrying than, I don't think that every one of us has to think every second about not saying something because how it can be used.
Yeah, but then when Haaretz decides to cover what is happening in Gaza during the war, it's like, so they're being declared, we are being declared as the traitors, right? Because, or the Israel's biggest enemy, as Amit Segal said.
Well, I think one important fact about what we do at Haaretz is that there are no shortage of axes to grind wherever it is on the political base. You know, if it's coming from the far left, that we're apologists, or that we're coming from the far right, that we're enablers. You know, I think it honestly is something that, to a certain point, we can kind of wear as a badge of honor, that we are just so committed to telling what is happening on the ground without any BS or any outside influence trying to manipulate or navigate the way it is that we cover it. You know, I think we all wake up and do our job and go to sleep and, you know, do the whole thing over and over and over again with just such a clear-eyed point of view and such a clear admission. And I think that is something that, you know, makes Haaretz unique in the Israeli media landscape, but I think it also makes us unique in terms of how other people are covering this war, where, you know, we aren't just acting like a cat chasing our own tail. And I think that sort of, you know, really clear-eyed, no-nonsense dedication to covering this the way that it deserves to be covered is something that really underlays everything that we do.
Questions?
I'm going to jump in with the first question if I can. As journalists, do you feel in the last 2 years of coverage, were there things that you wanted to say that you couldn't, that you felt that, and even worse, maybe you self-censored, but actually beyond that, if the editorial wouldn't let that go through?
No.
And can you talk about it without getting fired?
Well, no. I was actually, when I came here, I've been here for 3 months now because I'm doing some fellowship in Harvard, and I was surprised how, I mean, I always knew that Haaretz is a very, you know, is a very free newspaper, and that freedom of speech is like the most fundamental value of the newspaper, and nothing can change that. But I was surprised how unique it is when I compare it to my fellows now in at Nieman Fellowship, because it's like, yeah, nowhere else. I don't want to get into, you know, specifics because it's like, I don't know, off the record or whatever. But let's say that, yeah, other places, even countries that are supposed to be very free, and that, you know, where freedom of speech and is like the most important value, are behind Haaretz. So I once published an article against Amos Shoken in Haaretz.
Amos Shoken is the Haaretz publisher,
he's the publisher.
Anybody.
That was directly against him about never mind what, and that was published in the page 2 at Haaretz, where the articles are, op-eds.
I think for me, there's this opposite instinct to like run towards, like trying to say everything, or trying to deal with stuff as they're happening, even when they're most contentious. So like, let's say, you know, stuff that came up from both sides, right, about genocide. Like in November of 2024, there were people saying, oh, you need to label it as genocide. Other people said, you know, obviously not. So going to these places, going to the most complex and contentious places and touching them, and I never got any pushback. I actually got like the go-ahead on everything, you know, and you get a lot of shit for it on both sides. But I think this is what our instinct is to go to those places, to not to make a determination. I don't want a determination, but to ask questions from those people who are really engaged and involved with this, to really understand not only what is this a genocide, I mean, but what are the motivations behind it, what are the politics behind it, what the definition of genocide, you know, I just interviewed a professor who did a book about anti-Semitism, and trying to understand what do we say when we say anti-Semitism, right? Because it's been hurled around for the past 2 years in so many ways. So the idea of rushing towards these most contentious issues, that's what I find unique about arts.
Yeah, I would also add that, as an Iranian who wrote a few articles for Haaretz, first I was very touched with his experience because our two countries are obviously official enemies. There's so little contacts between them. So to work with an Israeli editor and write from an Iranian perspective, which I did during the war, by the first day of the Iranian-Israel war, I wrote an article in Haaretz, about the war and how it's not in the interest of, either of our countries. And this was my editor there could have been killed in an Iranian missile, as she was editing. It's a fact. And as my family members in Iran were fleeing the Israeli bombs. So it was a very touching moment. But I would also say that generally, and it goes back to what we were talking about before, one thinks about one's work in an entire period. And as to, are we covering all sides or not? Because you're always open to accusation. It's always funny for me when they say, why didn't you work on this or not? Or, I'm Etan's friend. I can see he's lucky if he gets, time to put his son to sleep. So the idea that why didn't you also cover that? I mean, the reason is you didn't have time, right? Usually there's a limit. But I would say that in the Atlantic, once I wrote 2 articles within a couple of weeks. One was against boycotting Israel, explaining why I was against boycotting Israeli films and Israeli writers and stuff. And the second was in support of the International Criminal Court's arrest order for Netanyahu. And the Atlantic was happy to publish both. And I didn't, when I didn't know that this is going to happen, like that this will happen after the other. But I was happy that I was able to say both.
Yeah, and I think, kind of what I was saying before and kind of what Etan was saying is that, short answer, no, I've never once been censored or felt the tendency to self-censor. But that sort of encouragement to go there and to write about anything that the moment demands, it's not coming from a place of being provocative for the sake of provocative. It's not coming from a place where you just want to, stir stuff for the sake of stirring stuff. It is what the moment deserves, and it's what Haaretz's added value is in this really oversaturated, crowded media landscape that is trying to make sense of this madness in real time. And we've been doing this for a very long time, and we have the sort of grounding and sense of context and a sense of information that other people that may otherwise just be sort of parachuting into this conflict and trying to make sense of everything in real time, we aren't beholden to those same considerations. So not only do we feel the need to, go there and to, give it the thing it deserves, but, it really is a burden that we welcome, that, this is the way that we need to cover it, and this is the way that we need to just say how it is, whatever that moment demands. So I don't think that's necessarily.
I'll just add that, between left and right or pro-anti-war, I think Haaretz, from as far as I'm concerned, tell the story about an Israeli experience. And it's not the Israeli perspective, but it's one, whether Israelis or not, it rooted in Israeli society, regardless. So beyond right and left or anything, it's that. I think that makes it unique.
Yeah, when people ask me what I cover, I say I cover the politics of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in America. Because, it is, not just, is this president going to finally say this mean thing about Benjamin Netanyahu after hinting that he's going to say this mean thing for 8 weeks, It's just so much more broad and complicated and just nuanced and detailed than that it would really be doing a disservice if we just sort of kind of were chasing that 30-second empty calorie 200-word news story. It's so much more than that, and that really underlays everything I do personally. I know it underlays everything that my colleagues do. I know it is just sort of the motivation of everything we do. My wife is an audience, but short of her, Maya is the first person I speak to in the morning, the last person I speak to at night. So, there is just always this sort of presence of mind and this sort of real kind of understanding of where we are at this moment, but also taking a step back and really understanding ourselves and explaining to the readers, what does this moment mean in the short term, in the medium term, in the bigger picture. So that really is kind of there constantly.
I want to say, I'll make it short because we should take more questions. But I want to say that as much as our reporters are undeterred in their reporting, and as much as we all feel that we have, in a way that we work for a place that has our backs, I can't say that I haven't had conversations with writers in the past, especially in the past 2 years, where they did decide not to write about certain things because of the backlash that they were going to get from, or told me that they were afraid to write about things more because of the backlash that they were expecting to get on social media, or from other Israeli media in a way. Those are the only things that I've seen. I haven't seen anybody being told not to write about anything, only in a way, sometimes deciding that it wasn't worth but more the emotional consequence.
This is sort of a question based on what you've been saying, directly connected to that as well. But, I was in Kibbutz Be'eri, and there was like a woman there with a selfie stick from LA going through the burned houses. And obviously Haaretz has a very, very different approach. And I'm wondering if you already had sort of guidelines or like a stance around some of these most covered and most traumatic and most potentially propagandized stories, both like from a professional perspective and emotionally as people in these situations, how you covered it in a smart way.
I don't know if you mean more the guidelines ethically or also, on a personal level.
I think anything.
Okay.
Yeah. Why is the Haaretz coverage of anything that you used in those moments?
One thing that, as someone who more manages people than writes, I can say that from the very beginning, there was also the understanding that, the same day we had Amir Tibon, who is, he was then a diplomatic correspondent, was stuck in a safe room in Nacharoz with his family, and also he like called the desk because nobody remembers phone numbers anymore. It was like the only phone number that he and all and things like that. And there was more. There's the editor of the Marker, Sivan Klingbeil. She's also from kibbutz there. And so people were very. And then there were the reporters that went down from Tel Aviv, and they didn't even know, I think, when they did it, if they were going to report or they were going, a lot of them ended up saving people, just bringing people back. And so I think the first few days were it was mixed for people. And there was no decision of like, not letting people write about something that they're experiencing, but there was pretty fast we offered people psychological support, therapy, things like that. Some people still use it at the paper.
We could use it, but it.
What?
I try. Yeah, there was a few days after October 7th, the newspaper offered us counseling. There was a woman sitting in the offices of the newspaper, just waiting for reporters to come. And I once went to talk to her, and because I felt that my reaction felt wrong to me because I didn't feel anything. So I went to see if that's okay not to feel post-traumatic. Anyway, yeah, personally, I realized that there were some guidelines that emerged. It wasn't anything official, but for instance, when it comes to interviewing the hostages, I think that I really wanted to give them, not to call them the minute they come home, and try to give them some time to heal. And I think it's wrong to try to interview them immediately after they come back, especially the ones that were there for a long time, because there were a few steps of there were a few, not all of them stayed there the same amount of time. So that was giving them their space and time. I think it was very important. And with the families, and also then trying to listen what they really want to talk about, which is also part of what we talked about before, because I think some of the outlets, I would say, in Israel also try to use those stories as some kind of propaganda, even internal propaganda, just to, okay, so tell us how horrible it was, because this is what we want to hear, It all kind of served a narrative that was written before, it was already there, and they just needed to kind of give the proof that what we thought is actually real, it's true. But and when it comes to the families, I found myself several times in very complicated situations that I interviewed people in a horrible despair, and they just didn't know what to do or what to say in order to promote the release of their loved ones, and they were afraid that anything they will say can be used against them. So I remember one situation that I was sitting with 3 members of the same family, and each and every one of them had this very powerful speech about what they think about their situation, and who's why the government is not doing enough, and who's to blame. And then the one that said, and then the other one said, but you cannot write that. You don't write it. This. And then the other one was coming with the same speech about something else, and then the mother would say, no, but you cannot write that. So they were just censoring each other, and I was and I don't want to harm them. I mean, I'm there to help them in this situation. I don't want to, my journalistic mission is somehow less important than to not to cause any damage. I remember that was one of the most difficult moments, my professional moments I've ever had, and writing this interview was very complicated, because I wanted to take under consideration all their wishes, and not to. So yeah.
I would also just very similar to that point, I would say that also has extended my experience to speaking to Palestinian victims. And, I've spoken to Palestinians who've lost dozens of family members in Gaza, and, have been victims of settler violence in the West Bank or Israeli military violence in the West Bank. And there is a real understandable hesitancy to speak to an Israeli newspaper. And, I think there is a very real sort of responsibility and nuance, and really, it's not that you're surrendering complete control to them to tell them how you're going to tell their story, but you really do have to consider that, because they themselves are going out on a ledge to talk about their fresh permanent trauma that they just underwent. And it's a very delicate line to navigate, and it's something that it rests very heavy on your shoulders when you're reporting it out and when you're writing it, when you're telling it, and when it goes online, and you know that there are just bad faith actors from whatever side of the debate that are waiting to just kind of pounce on it. So it's a responsibility and it's a burden for sure.
Oh, wait, sorry.
Hi, you mentioned that the last mayoral election was a referendum on Israel. I didn't catch it that way. I thought the last mayoral election was more of local issues, on affordability issues, and free daycare and free buses. Hell, I almost voted for him for that. But Israel did have a role in it. I think 2/3 of Jews in New York voted for someone other than Mamdani.
Yeah.
That was a catch which I understood as well.
Yeah.
But
No.
if I lived in Richmond Hill, Queens, I would be more concerned about my groceries and free daycare than I would about
I
Israel.
take
No
it you
offense.
haven't read much of Etan's coverage of the election, but
No. I think in the end, it wasn't a referendum on Israel, but there was
a lot of people were trying to make it.
There was a concerted effort to make it on Mamdani's past statements. Whether you agree with him, I mean, that's beside the point.
They tried to make it like that.
I was just saying about the discourse in the debate, which
In Israel.
no,
Or
I'm saying here,
Here?
New York, was a lot about heightened about Mamdani's past statement on Israel. I was just saying that this discourse around Israel, pro-Palestine, pro-Israel, whatever it is, labels, have permeated into everything. And what should be a race about affordability has become also about where do you stand on, Israel right to exist, or whether you're going to travel to Israel. As moderators in the debate asked candidates.
I just wanted to ask you, what about censorship? Were you free to report? Could you go and talk to people? Could you then report what they told you? Because I was privileged to hear a lot of the people in the beginning would come from the Yeshuvim, and they would talk about their experiences without the newspaper. But I was wondering what the news, because I know that the government initially censored Haaretz so long ago. So I just wondered how much freedom did Haaretz have in reporting whatever it wanted to report?
I think you're confusing a few different things. Israel, as a country, has military censorship, where any newspaper that operates in Israel is obligated to submit certain material to the military censorship.
Only things that are related to the military.
Yes, only things that are related to
Security.
National security.
To national security. And Haaretz is not different than any other Israeli media in that way. But first of all, after 2 years of war, I can't say that there is anything that I would say substantial that was that we were prevented from reporting. And like I said before, I from my perspective, most of what the Israeli media hasn't been reporting is because of self-censorship in a way, and we haven't had any issues with. I mean, obviously, our problem with reporting on Gaza is the fact that we can't be there, but we have put a lot of effort into building relationships with people on the ground to be able to report from there. And that, is a big part of what we do.
And I think it's also interesting where you can really, it almost acts as a case study for the Israeli government itself because, I was an editor before I was a reporter in the 2010s. And anytime Israel would bomb Syria, you would have to report it in a way, bombs in Syria according to foreign media reports.
Right.
In the past few years, you've really seen the Israeli government become more emboldened in real time to be like, yep, this was us. We did this. And it's not only in Syria, but it's in Iran and Lebanon, recently in Qatar, which really kind of kick-started this whole diplomatic process that brought about the ceasefire. So it's really interesting to see how the Israeli government, and the Israeli military, I should say, is really kind of using the censorship as a sort of, we're choosing not to censor this because we want to, we want the public to know that we're taking ownership of this.
We'll take one last question.
I'm interested in the self-censorship of the readers. Just like here, you have the people who watch MSNBC or read, and watch Fox. Obviously, the same thing goes on in Israel. And we've heard many, many reports that people who don't read Haaretz in Israel claimed that they were really not aware of the extent of what was happening in Gaza, particularly around the famine, let alone the killings. And I wonder how you, as reporters and journalists, struggle with that issue, knowing that the majority of the people are not getting access to the stories that you so importantly try to tell.
I think that in a way, I would say for a very long time in the beginning, I was very understanding of Israelis that kind of took a conscious decision of not necessarily watching everything that is happening in Gaza, and I think it's understandable on a psychological level, but I never thought that it's something that, as a journalist, I'm supposed to, cater to. So I think that what people see and don't, and also I just don't, I think it's, it's a crime that Israeli television, wasn't showing footage from Gaza or wasn't explaining that people were starting to go hungry or anything. But I also think that it's impossible these days not to see the images, and that I don't think that there are many people that weren't exposed to what was going on. And I have I have complaints, I fight with my friends about it or be disappointed with, family members if they don't want to know things. But I can't really complain, to people personally, only to really people that I see it as their, I just, journalists that decide to not report on this or, stay away from it. The only thing is, I don't understand what they think their job is, and that's
it's
like
the difference between journalism and entertainment. I mean, we had to report about it, and it just had to be there for whoever will be ready to read it. But even if they don't, we did our job, and I think also for the sake of history, it's good that we did that.
Yeah, I think I think it was one of the. Maybe also during the height of the anti-Netanyahu protests before the war, but more so during the war, there is also something that you really do feel that you're doing something for history. Like, even if not everybody will be receptive to it right now. I mean, it will be there when they're ready, and it will be there for when, if ever, there will be.
someone will try to say we didn't know,
or
no
yeah,
one told
or
us.
there will ever be a government committee that will look into it, or an international court. But yeah, there is something that you have to do it even if it's not for this moment.
Folks, we're running out of time, but I know there's eager last statements, so let's get some brief last statements out of.
Yeah, I just want to say that, it's very interesting, the opposite side. When you live in a situation like in Iran, where the state controls all the propaganda, you actually have a very enviable position as a dissident voice in which most of the people listen to you and they don't believe what the government says. I never forget, once I was an anchor on a TV station abroad, and someone from a police in Iran called me and said, look, can you declare that the roads in the north of Iran are really closed? Because when it comes from your channel, people will believe it, but they don't believe anything we say, but the roads are really closed. So, I think it's important to remember that that's where you get. If Israel, and I hope not, right, but if it gets to a situation in which, you have this mono voice at the top, people will start getting desensitized to it, and they will stop believing it.
And not only that, but I think there is a cottage industry, of people that are, leaning in the opposite direction and are just acting as, a bootlicking service to the Israeli government, and they are trying to actively deny established facts on the ground. Whether they're putting out, listicles on 10 reasons why the famine isn't actually real, or, it is just not even recycling talking points, but just regurgitating them verbatim. And, it is a real-time thing that is happening in this moment, and it's continuing to happen with increasing force and increasing financial power and increasing motivation to make this true as a counterweight to fact-based reporting. And that only makes the urgency of this moment, as far as we're concerned, more significant.
I want to give a huge thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Really, the work of Haaretz is crucial at this time, a time when there's so much noise out there, and it's our job to make sure that Haaretz's work comes to the top. So thank you all for being here and being a part of this. Thank you for being a part of this conversation and sharing with our community. And please join us next up at 2:30 is A Place of Her Own. And of course, many more films today. Please join us, and all week. Thank you very much. And
Thank you so much.
Have a good day.
Isaac
Thank
and
you.
the whole festival.
Thank you.